The secret rules for handling possessed people. This case is remembered not because of a single possession, but because of the internal guidelines followed before any ritual begins. The priest did not start with prayer. He did not confront the subject. He followed rules most people never hear about. Before any exorcism is authorized, clergy follow a structured process. Not dramatic, methodical. These internal rules are designed to prevent misidentification and unnecessary escalation. In one documented case, the attending priest delayed intervention despite visible distress in the subject. Observers questioned the hesitation, but the priest explained that protocol required confirmation first, medical evaluation, psychological assessment, extended observation during prayer. Only after those steps could formal action begin. Another rule required minimal audience, no unnecessary witnesses. Fewer people meant fewer variables and clearer observation. During the evaluation, clergy also avoided direct confrontation early. Instead of issuing commands immediately, they documented responses to simple prayers and neutral questions. This helped determine whether reactions were spontaneous or influenced by expectation. The priest later noted that one of the most important rules was rarely spoken aloud. Never assume severity from appearance. Some subjects who appeared calm required extended intervention. Others who seemed distressed stabilized quickly. The rules also emphasized continuity. The same priest, whenever possible, handled follow-up sessions to avoid inconsistency. In the reported case, adherence to these guidelines led to a controlled intervention and successful recovery. In his final report, the priest wrote, "Procedure protects both the subject and the clergy." The Vatican sealed the case. The final notation in the archive reads, "Discipline precedes authority." Some stories frighten because of what happens during the ritual, others because of what must happen before it. If you're drawn to Catholic mysteries, sealed church archives, or items tied to faith and protection, I keep those collected in my Amazon store. Nothing required. Some people just prefer not to leave stories like this without grounding. So tell me, do you think these rules exist to control the situation or to prevent mistakes before they begin? The Vatican's emergency possession protocol. This case is remembered not because of the possession itself, but because it triggered a response reserved for urgent situations. The evaluation was routine. The symptoms were manageable. Then the emergency protocol was activated. Most cases follow a gradual process. Observation, medical assessment, careful evaluation during prayer. Only after those steps is formal intervention authorized. But in rare situations, clergy are permitted to bypass parts of that sequence. In one documented case, the subject's condition shifted unexpectedly during evaluation. Not violently, rapidly. Responses to prayer became immediate and unusually consistent. Clergy noted the change was not escalation, it was acceleration. The attending priest requested authorization for emergency protocol. Approval was granted within minutes. This protocol did not involve new prayers or dramatic ritual changes. It involved coordination. Additional clergy were notified. A secure location was prepared. Documentation began immediately rather than after the session. The goal was containment and clarity, not confrontation. During the intervention, prayers were kept brief and precise. Observers were limited to essential personnel. Every response from the subject was recorded in real time. The priest later wrote that the emergency protocol exists not for dramatic cases, but for unpredictable ones. When the intervention concluded, the subject stabilized and later recovered. In the final report, the attending clergy emphasized that the protocol's purpose was prevention. Urgency is not about fear. It is about reducing uncertainty. The Vatican sealed the case. The closing notation in the archive reads, "Preparation allows authority to act without delay." Some stories frighten because of what happens, others because of how quickly it must be handled. If you're drawn to Catholic mysteries, sealed Vatican protocols, or items tied to faith and protection, I keep those collected in my Amazon store. Nothing required. Some people just prefer not to leave stories like this without grounding. So tell me, do you think the emergency protocol exists for rare dangers or for moments when hesitation matters most? The files that are never digitized. This case is remembered not because of what the documents contain, but because of how they were preserved. The report was completed. The archive received it, but it was never entered into the digital system. Most modern church records are carefully cataloged, dates logged, documents scanned, access tracked electronically. Digitization allows consistency and retrieval across dioceses, but some files remain excluded. In one documented case, the attending priest submitted a full report after an extended evaluation. Medical notes were attached, clergy observations included, ritual documentation finalized. When the archive processed the material, one instruction stood out. The file was to be stored physically only. No scan, no digital entry. The reasoning was procedural, not traumatic. Certain records, especially those involving sensitive testimony or handwritten, notes are preserved in original form to avoid misinterpretation or unauthorized distribution. The physical file was sealed and placed in restricted storage. Access required in-person authorization. No remote retrieval. In later years, when another priest requested historical comparison, the archive confirmed the file existed but could only be reviewed on site. The attending cleric later wrote, "Some records are preserved not for secrecy, but for accuracy." The Church maintains that original documents can contain context marginal notes, handwriting, and corrections that digital copies might miss. The Vatican sealed the handling details of the case. The final notation in the archive reads, "Preservation is not always about access. Sometimes it is about integrity." Some stories frighten because of what they reveal, others because of how carefully they're kept. If you're drawn to Catholic mysteries, sealed Vatican archives, or items tied to faith and protection, I keep those collected in my Amazon store. Nothing required. Some people just prefer not to leave stories like this without grounding. So tell me, do you think those files stay physical for protection, or because some things aren't meant to circulate? The locked cabinet of failed rituals. This case is remembered not because of a single ritual, but because of where certain reports are kept afterward. Within church record systems, completed cases are categorized by outcome: resolved, ongoing, transferred. But there is another classification rarely discussed publicly: rituals that were stopped, repeated, or required reassessment. In one documented instance, a priest submitted a report after a session produced inconsistent results. The subject had shown partial stabilization, but not full resolution. The ritual text had been followed precisely. No procedural errors were identified. Still, the outcome remained unclear. When the report reached the archive, it was marked for restricted handling. Instead of general storage, the file was placed in a locked cabinet reserved for similar cases. The purpose was not secrecy. It was reference. Clergy reviewing difficult cases could consult these files to understand where adjustments had been necessary. The cabinet contained structured documentation, original ritual notes, follow-up evaluations, recommendations for revised approach. In later years, another priest requested access while handling a complex case. After reviewing several entries, he altered the timing of his intervention. The adjustment proved effective. The Church clarified that such files are preserved to prevent repetition of ineffective timing or sequence, not to hide outcomes. The Vatican sealed the specific case details. The final notation in the archive reads, "An incomplete ritual is not a failure. It is a record awaiting understanding." Some stories frighten because of what succeeds, others because of what must be tried again. If you're drawn to Catholic mysteries, sealed church archives, or items tied to faith and protection, I keep those collected in my Amazon store. Nothing required. Some people just prefer not to leave stories like this without grounding. So tell me, Do you think that cabinet exists to hide failed rituals, or to make sure the same mistake isn't repeated? The hidden library of demonic texts. This case is remembered not because of a single possession, but because of the books consulted before the ritual began. The evaluation stalled. A request was made, and a set of restricted texts was brought from storage. During complex investigations, clergy sometimes reference older theological materials, not for ritual use, for context. In one documented case, the subject's responses included phrasing unfamiliar to the attending priest. The wording did not match common liturgical references. Rather than proceed immediately, the priest requested consultation materials from church archives. Several bound volumes were delivered, older texts preserved primarily for historical study. These writings contained documented phrases, theological interpretations, and prior observations recorded across centuries. Their purpose was not to encourage ritual variation. It was to recognize patterns. As the priest reviewed the material, one passage contained language similar to what the subject had spoken. Not identical, but structurally close. That comparison allowed the clergy to interpret the responses more clearly and proceed with standard protocol rather than improvisation. The ritual was later completed successfully. In his report, the priest wrote, "Understanding context reduces uncertainty." The Church maintains that such restricted libraries exist for scholarship and reference, not secrecy or dramatics. Access is limited simply to ensure the texts are used responsibly and preserved accurately. The Vatican sealed the case. The final notation in the archive reads, "Knowledge preserved for study prevents reaction based on assumption. Some stories frighten because of what is done, others because of what must be understood first. If you're drawn to Catholic mysteries, sealed church archives, or items tied to faith and protection, I keep those collected in my Amazon store. Nothing required." Some people just prefer not to leave stories like this without grounding. So tell me, do you think those texts are hidden to protect people, or to make sure they're read only when necessary?